Hello, my name is Salian Ohene. I work at the Ghana office of the World Health Organization, where I am the Disease Prevention and Control Officer. My work portfolio also includes rabies prevention and control.
In the previous model, you learned about the 0 by 30 rabies elimination strategy. Now, it is my pleasure to guide you through the third module of the course titled Preventing Rabies in People. In this module, you learn about what to do in case of animal bite, how post-exposure prophylaxis works, what rabies vaccines are available and how they should be administered, what a post-exposure prophylaxis schedule looks like, and the challenges accessing post-exposure prophylaxis in rabies endemic countries. When you suspect an exposure to rabies, you need to wash the wound and seek prompt medical attention. You may have been exposed to rabies if you experience nibbling on your skin, scratches, abrasions, and bites, even if they do not bleed, from an animal that is suspected to have rabies, or if there has been contact between this animal's saliva and your eyes, mouth, or an open wound. If these activities occur with a healthy animal, there's no cause for concern. Direct contact with wild mammals, including bats, can also be an exposure. I will cover exposure categories later in this model. If you do suspect exposure, you should immediately wash the wound and seek medical assistance as soon as possible. Your doctor can perform a risk assessment and start post-exposure prophylaxis if you need it. Post-exposure prophylaxis consists of a series of vaccines and in some cases, rabies immunoglobulin. Remember, if you have been exposed to a suspected rabid animal, rabies can still be prevented. When you suspect a rabies exposure, wound washing is the first thing you should do and can be life-saving, so it is important to do it properly. Immediately after exposure, wash the bite or scratch for 15 minutes using plenty of running water and soap. Then, you should apply an iodine-containing disinfectant to the area. Homemade remedies like chili, salt, lemon, or herbs are not recommended because they do not eliminate the virus, but rather irritate the wound. After wound washing, you need to seek medical assistance, where your doctor will perform a risk assessment and decide whether you need post-exposure prophylaxis. Whether you need post-exposure prophylaxis depends on 3 things. Firstly, the health status of the animal. You only need post-exposure prophylaxis if the animal you had contact with is suspected to have rabies. To determine whether an animal is healthy or suspected to have rabies, it should be assessed by a trained veterinary professional. If it is not possible to assess the animal, you may still need post-exposure prophylaxis. Secondly, how bad your wound is. Not all contacts with an animal, rabid or not, require post-exposure prophylaxis. WHO wound categories can help to determine whether you need further care. And third, whether you have received rabies vaccine in the past. This could be in the form of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is available and recommended to people at high risk of exposure, like veterinarians, or a previous series of post-exposure prophylaxis. Even if you previously received rabies vaccines, you may still need post-exposure prophylaxis and should still seek medical advice if you suspect exposure. I will cover each of these steps in more detail next. The first step is to evaluate the health status of the animal you have been exposed to. Only a trained veterinary professional can perform this assessment. They will look for clinical signs of rabies in the animal, such as hypersalivation, paralysis, lethargy, unprovoked abnormal aggression, meaning biting two or more people or animals and or inanimate objects, strange vocalization, and activity during the day in nocturnal animals. Rabies should be suspected if any of these signs are present. The second step is to evaluate your wound, which should be performed by a doctor. WHO has identified 3 categories based on the likelihood of exposure to rabies. Category 1 means no exposure is likely and includes animal licks on intact skin and touching and feeding animals. Category 2 means exposure is likely and includes minor scratches or abrasions without bleeding and nibbling of uncovered skin. Minor scratches should never be ignored if the animal is suspected to have rabies. Category 3 means severe exposure is likely and includes single or multiple bites or scratches that includes bleeding. Contact between animal saliva and eyes, mouth, or an open wound, and direct contact with wild mammals, including bats. For Category 2 and 3 exposures, the closer to the brain the wound is, the faster the virus will travel to the brain. In this situation, prompt medical care is even more critical to prevent rabies. The third step is to consider whether you have already received rabies vaccine or pre-exposure prophylaxis. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is recommended for people at high risk of rabies exposures, such as people who live in remote, highly endemic areas with limited access to timely and adequate post-exposure prophylaxis, travelers to such areas, and individuals who are exposed to rabies because of their job, such as veterinarians. Pre-exposure prophylaxis consists of 2 doses of vaccine taken 1 week apart. You are also considered to be pre-exposure vaccinated if in your life you have already received 2 or more doses of rabies vaccine. For example, if you were previously bitten by a suspected rabid animal and you have received at least 2 doses of post-exposure prophylaxis, this counts as pre-exposure prophylaxis. In any case, being previously vaccinated does not replace the need for post-exposure prophylaxis, although it does shorten it. So, you should still seek medical attention if you suspect exposure. Based on these 3 factors, the doctor will decide whether you need post-exposure prophylaxis. For people with a Category 1 exposure, wound washing is enough. For people with a Category 2 exposure or people who have been previously vaccinated for rabies, wound washing and a series of rabies vaccines are indicated. People with a Category 3 exposure require wound washing, a series of rabies vaccines, and also rabies immunoglobulin. There are many rabies vaccines out there, and 4 of them, Vaxirab-N, Verorab, Rabivax-S, and Rabipur, are recommended by WHO because they are safe, effective, and very well tolerated. Some countries may use other vaccines that may still comply with WHO standards. The most important thing is to rely only on vaccines from a trusted healthcare provider or pharmacist. Nerve tissue vaccines, which are the old generation of rabies vaccines that were administered via injections into the stomach, are not recommended anymore. Modern vaccines are not injected into the stomach and are very well tolerated by patients. Modern vaccines can be administered both intradermally, meaning under the skin, and intramuscularly, meaning into the muscle. All WHO recommended vaccines can be administered by either route and use the same injection sites. In adults, the injection must be given in the arm. In children, the injection can be given in the arm or the thigh. Vaccinations must never be given in the gluteal region, where it may be difficult to reach the muscle. Where possible, WHO recommends intradermal vaccination because it saves doses, costs, and requires fewer visits to the doctor. When used for intradermal vaccination, vials can be shared among patients, saving up to 80% of the cost of post-exposure prophylaxis, but only if they are used within 8 hours. Rabies immunoglobulin is different from rabies vaccines. While rabies vaccines need time to act, rabies immunoglobulin stops the virus right at the wound site, so it is recommended for severe Category 3 exposures. However, there are 2 cases when rabies immunoglobulin should not be used. 1. If you have been previously vaccinated against rabies, you should not receive rabies immunoglobulin. If you have previously received only rabies immunoglobulin, it is acceptable to receive it again. 2. If you have received your first dose of post-exposure prophylaxis vaccine more than 7 days ago, you should not receive rabies immunoglobulin. Rabies immunoglobulin is also administered in a different way to rabies vaccines. It must be injected deep into and around all wounds. This can be uncomfortable, especially where there are multiple wounds, but is life-saving. The maximum dose of rabies immunoglobulin is calculated based on body weight, although it can be diluted if needed for administration across large and multiple wounds. There are 2 kinds of rabies immunoglobulin, one made of human rabies antibodies and one made of equine rabies antibodies. Both are equally effective and neither require skin tests before administration. Researchers are also working on an alternative to rabies immunoglobulin, such as monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are laboratory-made proteins that mimic the immune system's ability to fight off harmful pathogens such as viruses. The first anti-rabies monoclonal antibody was licensed in India in 2017, but other candidates are being evaluated in clinical trials. Compared to rabies immunoglobulin, monoclonal antibodies can be produced on a larger scale, are more effective, do not require the use of animals in lab research, and have fewer adverse effects. In the meantime, rabies immunoglobulin is a life-saving biological for severe exposures. Now let's discuss the typical schedule for post-exposure prophylaxis. If you have never been vaccinated for rabies, 3 regimens exist. Your doctor will choose one, depending on what vaccine is available. The IPC regimen is recommended because it is the shortest and takes just 1 week. It requires 3 visits to the doctor on days 0, 3, and 7. In each visit, you receive 1 intradermal injection in each arm. The SN regimen requires 4 visits to the doctor and takes 2 weeks. Visits are on days 0, 3, 7, and 14 and involve 1 intramuscular injection in 1 arm. The Zagreb regimen requires 3 visits to the doctor and takes 3 weeks. Visits are on days 0, 7, and 21. In the first visit, you receive 1 intramuscular injection in each arm. In the second and third visits, you receive 1 intramuscular injection in 1 arm. If you need rabies immunoglobulin, you'll be given it on day 0, or if not available, within 7 days of receiving your first rabies vaccine, but never later. If you have been previously vaccinated against rabies, you do not need rabies immunoglobulin, and post-exposure prophylaxis is shorter. There are 3 regimens available for previously vaccinated people. The one-site ID regimen involves 2 visits to the doctor on days 0 and 3, where you receive 1 intradermal injection in 1 arm. The 4-site ID regimen involves a single visit to the doctor, where you receive 4 intradermal injections. The 1-site IM regimen involves 2 visits to the doctor on days 0 and 3, where you receive 1 intramuscular injection in 1 arm. If you are exposed to rabies and have already completed a course of post-exposure prophylaxis in the past 3 months, you do not need any prophylaxis this time. You should also remember that while it is important to start post-exposure prophylaxis as soon as it is recommended, it is never too late to do it unless clinical signs of rabies are already evident. Here are some answers to frequently asked questions about rabies prophylaxis. If pre- or post-exposure doses are delayed, vaccination should be resumed, not restarted. Pre- and post-exposure doses are the same regardless of your age or weight. If it cannot be avoided, it is acceptable to change between the type of vaccine and route of administration, that is, intradermal or intramuscular vaccination, during the same course of pre- or post-exposure prophylaxis. Post-exposure prophylaxis should never be delayed if rabies immunoglobulin is not available on day 0. Post-exposure prophylaxis is not necessary if the person has drank milk from a rabid animal, although this is not recommended. And finally, post-exposure prophylaxis should never be delayed or suspended against medical advice. Traditional medicine is ineffective and cannot prevent or cure rabies. It can be dangerous when used as a substitute for proper wound management, or when it replaces or delays post-exposure prophylaxis. However, especially in marginalized areas, healers are sometimes the only option available to bite victims. Therefore, it is essential to seek dialogue and cooperation with healers to increase awareness of rabies and compliance with post-exposure prophylaxis. Unfortunately, equitable access to post-exposure prophylaxis is a problem in many parts of the world. Vaccines, and especially rabies immunoglobulin, can be expensive and may be in short supply or simply unavailable in many countries. Additionally, people may not seek medical care because they fear outdated nerve tissue vaccines or because they rely on traditional medicine, which has no power against rabies. And sometimes, post-exposure prophylaxis does not work as well as it could because it is not administered appropriately, because doses are delayed or interrupted, and where poor quality vaccines are used. In this model, you learned that rabies is preventable through wound washing and post-exposure prophylaxis for suspected exposures. Washing the wound with water and soap for 15 minutes is a first life-saving measure to prevent rabies. Whether you need post-exposure prophylaxis depends on the health status of the animal, the severity of the wound, and whether you have already received a rabies vaccine. Only exposure from a suspect rabid animal requires post-exposure prophylaxis. When exposure is suspected, medical care must be sought not only for major or multiple wounds, but also for scratches and abrasions without bleeding. Previously vaccinated people require a shorter course of post-exposure prophylaxis, but should still seek medical advice if they are exposed. Once recommended, vaccination should start immediately, but it is never too late to do it before the onset of symptoms. Rabies vaccines can be administered intradermally, recommended, or intramuscularly, and the shortest course involves 3 visits to the doctor over the course of 1 week. Severe exposures may also require rabies immunoglobulin, which must be administered in all wounds. Although vaccination should not be delayed if rabies immunoglobulin is not available. And traditional medicine is ineffective and will not prevent rabies. Here are the links to the documents and research papers on the topics covered by this module. This slide provides you with additional resources, including other open WHO courses that you may be interested in. In the next module of the course, we will focus on preventing rabies in dogs. I thank you for your attention.